Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the first presentation of today. My name is Arash Rafat. I'm an early career scientist with ICCI. And it's with great pleasure I'd like to introduce Patricia Cavalcanti here, who will be moderating today's event titled State of Marine Protection in the Southern Ocean, the Critical Role of CCAMLR in Achieving 30 by 30. Patricia?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to start thanking the organizers, Pam, Emmy, for all your help and the invitation. I'm Patricia Cavalcanti, and I'm here on behalf of the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition and Agenda Antarctica. Our first speaker is Matt Spencer. So please, Matt, if you could start. Thank you.
Brilliant. Just testing you can all hear and see me okay. Okay. Hi all. As introduced, I'm Matt Spencer, a researcher at the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, also known as ASOC. I'm here today to present our latest report and some of its key findings. The report itself took a holistic lens on the state of the Southern Ocean, the observable changes that have occurred and are presently occurring as a result of climate change, disruptions being caused by human activity down in the Southern Ocean, and the urgent need for marine protected areas, known as MPAs. Lastly, for the benefit of all of you that haven't read the 55-page report, although I would urge you to read it, we'll summarise this presentation with 3 recommendations that are urgently required. So, starting with the bare facts, the Antarctic is currently undergoing some of the most rapid responses to climate change on the planet, warming at approximately twice as quickly as the global average. Indeed, Antarctica now is contributing 6 times more water mass to the ocean than it did 30 years ago. In 2022 and 2023, we saw subsequent record low sea ice extent limits. And in 2022, we also saw a 38.5 degree temperature anomaly. So right now, I'm coming to you from a very murky 12 degree London. Would that temperature anomaly be occurring right now in London, it'd be 50 degrees centigrade. That puts it in perspective. Moreover, between 2002 and 2018, there have been 19 marine heatwave events recorded in the Southern Ocean. Against all this, we're now already observing biotic responses to these changes. Antarctic krill are now undergoing range shifts, and this has huge implications for the dependent ecosystem on which krill forms the base. There have also been notable breeding failures for penguin colonies across the Southern Ocean. The report makes it clear that climate change, coupled with human activity on the continent, is likely to create a compound stressor environment and will push many species towards the brink. So as we mentioned on the previous slide, our activity is creating a compound stressor environment, and fishing is the most disruptive of our activities in the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean has a long history and sorry history of exploitation, with sealers and whalers arriving centuries before the onset of industrialized fishing. More recently, there exist 2 predominant commercial fisheries in the Southern Ocean, that is, for krill and for toothfish, both of which are managed in an Olympic-style fishery. So for those that don't know, Olympic-style fisheries create a rush to fish, and this is often linked to severe competition for resources, leads to harvests that exceed sustainable levels, and fisheries characterized by an increasing number of highly efficient vessels fishing at an increasing pace. That's the background to the fisheries, but with regard specifically to toothfish, there are a number of stock assessments across the Southern Ocean indicating declines below management objectives, and still fishing is authorized. This is counter to CCAMLR's mission and pays lip service to the term precautionary management. On krill, there was a limit to the amount that can be caught against a precautionary biomass estimate, but catches have been increasing in recent years. The concerns have been growing that despite remaining within this total allowable catch, there's a hyper-localized nature of fishing activity, And increasingly, this fishing activity is happening in nearshore predator hotspots. So this is concerning in itself, but has been made all the more concerning at this year's CCAMLR meeting with a scaling back on regulation. This meant a removal of a conservation measure that tried to ensure catch will be spread out across management subunits. It's too early to tell what this might mean. This has happened only a few weeks ago, but already we're seeing heightened competition between the krill fishery and rebounding cetacean species in the Southern Ocean. For example, in 2021, there were 3 incidences of humpback whale bycatch. This is in addition to the reported incidental mortality of over 16 seals and many seabirds over several seasons. So what is CCAMLR? CCAMLR is the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. It's a bit of a tongue twister this hour. And CCAMLR itself is tasked with managing the sustainable use of the Southern Ocean. It's made up of 27 members, including the EU, and operates under a consensus-based decision-making process. So consensus decision-making means that all parties have to agree for conservation measures and agreements to be adopted. This consensus-based decision-making model in the Antarctica is now hamstrung by the present geopolitics that we see, with individual members able to disrupt environmental progress. The report highlighted that consensus blocking is a tactic that regularly occurs for around the establishment of marine protected areas, yet rarely, if at all, for fishing opportunity. CCAMLR now finds itself in an era of fishing freely, yet refusing to put the safety mechanisms in to protect the stocks that are being targeted. This overturns the precautionary approach, prioritizing extraction over CCAMLR's primary conservation mandate. So marine protected areas, or MPAs, what are they? Well, they're varied in their design, but in principle, they aim to protect the ecological process and ecosystem integrity of an area identified as important and or sensitive. It's been proven the world over that large-scale, well-designed MPAs with strong levels of protection have been shown to increase species biomass and genetic diversity, which in turn enhances species resilience to environmental changes, such as climate change. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework calls for 30% of ocean space to be protected by 2030. Now, with 26 of CCAMLR's 27 members being signatories to the GBF, you'd think they all believe in a world where 30% is both necessary and urgently required, and yet MPA process is still being hamstrung. Moreover, the report flags that in 2009, CCAMLR committed to establishing a representative network of MPAs in the Southern Ocean. So far, it's only designated 2, with 4 proposals backed by significant science and numerous supporters still under debate. CCAMLR, the report flags, is not living up to the promises it's made and is failing to safeguard the region it was set up to protect. With the High Seas Treaty yet to enter force, CCAMLR is one of the only existing mechanisms able to establish MPAs in areas beyond national jurisdiction and help deliver against the 30 by 30 targets. The report flags time is not on the side of the Southern Ocean, and it requires CCAMLR to return to the leader it once was in global conservation. But where there might be hindrances in CCAMLR due to the decision-making basis, there's been huge progress made in some of the sub-Antarctic islands. So the report flags the outsized role that these islands have had in protecting Southern Ocean ecosystems. The Southern Ocean hosts a number of these islands, which are claimed as territories by 5 different members of CCAMLR, although it's worth pointing out that several of these islands are ownership and sovereignty is disputed. There now exist 7 MPAs in the Southern Ocean, with 5 of these located around sub-Antarctic islands. Indeed, as the slide shows, of the 13% of the Southern Ocean that is under MPA protection, nearly half of this protection is accounted for MPAs surrounding sub-Antarctic islands outside of CCAMLR's jurisdiction. So the report makes 2 things clear. First, the opportunity and the observation that sub-Antarctic MPAs are contributing significantly towards Southern Ocean protection, but there is still further scaling up required for 30 by 30 ambitions. And secondly, CCAMLR is failing in its commitment to implement a system of representative MPAs in its jurisdictional area. So domain 9. So CCAMLR devised planning domains to help ensure a representative network of MPAs could be implemented in each of the distinctive ecoregions that surrounds Antarctica. Domain 9 is a vast region, home to unique and globally significant ecological features and species. Crucially, it's an area with little to no management in place. This matters massively as it is a region acutely experiencing climate change, with the area becoming more accessible to human activity and has significant ice shelf retreat present. There exists information on Domain 9's geomorphology, apex predators, special features, and fisheries habitats. So there is a need to make a start, and there is a basis to help support making that start. This huge gap in marine planning undermines CCAMLR's ambition to create a circumpolar network of MPAs, leaving an entire ecoregion lacking any form of adequate protection. But it is also an opportunity for a member of CCAMLR, or CCAMLR as a whole, to step up and start delivering meaningful protection in an area that needs it. So, as I started with, as much as I would encourage everyone to read the report, I took the initiative to summarise it in 3 recommendations for you. 1. The implementation of CCAMLR MPA proposals. There exist 4 outstanding MPA proposals yet to be adopted by CCAMLR. The Antarctic Peninsula, also known as Domain 1, that's the bit that juts out, I think it's on the flag in front of you. Weddell Sea Phase 1 and Phase 2 MPAs, and the East Antarctic MPA proposals have all been on the table for several years and have been supported by high quality science. Recommendation 2 is the development and implementation of a Domain 9 MPA. As I mentioned, the notable lack of a formal MPA proposal on Domain 9 leaves CCAMLR's promise to establish a system of MPAs unfulfilled, lacking any representative protection for the Southern Ocean bioregion and the biodiversity contained in Domain 9. And lastly, nations with sub-Antarctic islands to review their marine protection to account for a changing climate. Given the rapid changes that are now being observed in the region, the report recommended that all nations that have nationally determined MPAs in the Southern Ocean should undergo their review to strengthen marine protection in response to these shifting conditions. So there you have it, a 55-page report in about 11 minutes. That's no excuse not to read it. So if you just Google ASOC, Protecting a Changing Southern Ocean, that should bring you straight to the report. I've left my details up there if there's any follow-up questions from reading it. And please, just a reminder, do what you can for Southern Ocean. If not for me, then do it for the seal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, for your very insightful and detailed presentation about the report. Now, I would like to invite Pam Pearson. Oh, thank you, Matt, and thank you all of you for the detailed presentation about the report. Now, we're going to have Pam Pearson to present to you her own vision on the topic. Please, Pam.
Okay.
Is this first?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And please let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll just count on these folks to tell me if I'm speaking too loudly. What I wanted to talk about was the context in which CCAMLR is operating right now, which is a time of rapid climate change that is making it obvious that MPAs are both essential to the protection of species, and yet there are limits. And so I'm going to be talking about some of those limits today. And much of this is based on the 2024 State of the Cryosphere report that was released on Tuesday. And we include in that, even though it's not cryosphere, polar oceans, because they don't get enough attention from the oceans community, and they really deserve that. Yeah. I'm waiting for this to be, okay, here we go. Everything okay? All right. I don't want to press too hard on, there we go. So polar oceans are really facing multiple threats, but they also have multiple connections to the entire planet. They are, for example, and something I won't touch on much today, the massive amount of water that is melting off and freshening the Southern Ocean is having an impact on ocean currents. And so it's not just about the Southern Ocean and the species there, it really is about the entire planet. But I'm going to talk about three threats to these oceans and species: acidification, warming, and freshening. So first, on acidification. The global oceans are becoming much more acidic with decreasing pH. This is on the global level. You can see a real drop in that. However, still trying to advance here. Okay. Both polar oceans are absorbing CO2 much faster than the other oceans on the planet. This is, I'm not going to get into the chemistry also because I'm not a chemist, but we usually say cold water absorbs CO2 more readily. And it's actually the case that the Arctic and Southern Oceans have absorbed the lion's share of the CO2 that has been absorbed by the world's oceans. The estimate is maybe as much as 45% by the Southern Ocean alone. The Arctic is much less than that, perhaps 15, but you put these two together, it's maybe 60%. That's a vital ecosystem service, but of course it comes at a cost because they're acidifying much more rapidly. And the key issue that we're trying to convey to policymakers is, while all of these cryosphere elements that we talk about here respond to temperature and CO2 for very long periods of time, with the possible exception of sea ice, still, it's really polar ocean acidification that lasts the longest. It's 30 to 50,000 years before this can buffer out. This is obviously too long for many species to be able to survive. And so it is the least understood and in many ways the most long-lived and important of what we're dealing with. We're already seeing pteropod shell damage in the Southern Ocean. These pictures are actually from pteropods that were harvested from the Southern Ocean already around 2004, 2007. When CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere were just breaking over 400, and today we've peaked at 428 a couple of times already in the past year. The average for this year will probably be 424. We're way off the charts. And in MPAs, then, there's severe acidification also. So you can see from this chart that they are not immune to these processes, and you have declines of up to 0.36. Remember, this is a logarithmic scale when we're talking about pH. So that is a huge amount, and that is going to have an impact on the effectiveness of these. But looking ahead at projections, if we continue emitting carbon dioxide at our current rate, we're looking at massively acidic conditions in both of the polar oceans. And even with low emissions, very low emissions, you can see up above Siberia, there are areas that will be corrosive to shelled life year-round. In the Southern Ocean, there are also similar regions that are either seasonally or year-round corrosive to shelled animals, down through certainly at least the first 150 meters of the water column. And so even in a sense, very low emissions are causing damage, but nothing compared to what we're looking at already by end of century if we don't stop what we're doing. So it's a direct consequence of CO2 emissions, and the only way to limit that is to reduce emissions and hold CO2 levels really below 450, absolutely, but honestly, for the Southern Ocean, 430 should be our upper limit. And we're getting very close to that right now. This is why we're trying to say this is urgent, this is an emergency, and there's no way we can turn the clock back. once we get up to those levels. And the higher we go, the worse it gets. That's another message. You don't want people to give up entirely, but at the same time, it's really urgent that we reduce, and every ppm, right, of concentration matters. Moving on to warming now, which also has an extreme impact on species. Again, the Arctic is more well studied, so some of these focus on the Arctic, but you can see here that there's been quite a bit of warming going on in the Arctic Ocean, similar to, in the Southern Ocean. And this actually shows marine heat waves and the length and intensity of marine heat waves. And they're all focused in many ways in terms of the length and the amount by which we're above the mean in the Southern Ocean as well as the Arctic Ocean, really extreme. The only places where you have some whites are sort of either where there's not sufficient measurement capacity, or frankly, because you have so much cold water pouring off that in this upper level of the ocean, you've got actually cold water holding temperatures down, but then you can get this influx of really, really hot water that really stresses species and biodiversity in these regions. So our goals need to consider these kinds of heat thresholds because the polar oceans are just much more sensitive to warming. And finally, a bit on freshening. Again, these species are evolved to live in salt water. When you get fresh water pouring into that can affect their ability to simply function as species, to reproduce. It also is causing different kinds of disturbances of ocean currents. And again, this is focused on the Arctic. In Antarctica, what is primarily happening, so I'm just going to click through this, is that you do have this cold water pouring off and disturbing the Antarctic circumpolar current, but even more importantly, the overturning bottom water is being affected. And that, in a way, is the motor for the entire global ocean system. And that is beginning to slow down. That's being observed. It's not projected anymore. Okay, looks like, okay, good. So this is the amount of decline that has occurred and is projected to occur, 42% decline. That is going to perturbate through the entire ocean circulation system. I'm not an expert on this, but I've been told that 42% decline will then spread throughout the global ocean circulation system for about 300 years. And so it's really, really long term. And here again, the more of a decline we get, the longer the impact is going to be, not just in the Southern Ocean, but all ocean currents around the world. And most of it is being driven by meltwater. So we're seeing a lot of warning signs. The AMOC gets the most attention because Northern Europe is really worried about it getting cold. But here again, the AABW in many ways is more important and needs more attention. So here's one example that's been well studied in the Arctic. And I wanted to raise this because I'm pretty sure, and Rod Downey is here, so if he stops talking to Jan, perhaps we can, I might ask you to comment on whether or not there's something associated with krill that does the same sort of thing. So this is the example of cod. And as you can see, in its life history, the areas of higher acidification are very close to the areas where cod move and reproduce. And what you've got is kind of a cod sandwich effect is what we talk about, right? You have warmer water that is pushing up from the north that also brings invasive species. You've got freshening and also acidification pushing down from the Arctic region onto the cod. And as a result, they're being sandwiched in a way between multiple stressors. And so eventually when that gets too thin, there's basically nowhere for them to survive, at least not in the wild. And if you look again at current emissions continuing, this is going to become extreme. I suspect we have the same thing going on in the Southern Ocean. I just don't know if it's been studied as clearly when it comes to krill, but there is a krill focused side event here at 6 p.m. So feel free to come back for that. But this one, again, because cod is such a huge, important, how can I put this diplomatically? Very important cash fishery for a certain oil producing country. We raise this as much as we can. Salmon are equally affected, and we're seeing things in the Arctic region that are just strange, like the disappearance of lobster off of Iceland's coast about 8 or 10 years ago. Is that due to growing acidification? Was there a marine heat wave that wiped out the population? Or did it simply migrate naturally? We really don't know. But it's certainly troublesome when you have these patterns that have existed in some ways for local fisher folk for centuries, and suddenly that's gone. So the conclusions: the Southern Ocean is much more sensitive than other global oceans to CO2 and temperature and freshening also than the global average. These changes mostly are irreversible on human timescales. They're either 30 to 50,000 years. That's not really a human timescale. Or very long-term centuries when it comes to warming and currents. So MPAs can provide some protection, right? Because you've got all sorts of other stressors on species. And so we need to minimize those stressors as much as we possibly can. But also part of the strategy, I would say, of the community is to really focus also on what's happening here on emissions reductions, because there's no way MPAs don't protect from that global impact on them. And 1.5 greatly limits what those impacts are going to be, and that's why it really should be considered such a red line. So thank you so much, and we will move on now to the next virtual presentation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate Pam brought to us this broader vision of what's going on in the Southern Ocean and what marine protected areas can cover or not. Our next speaker is Gary Griffin, who would present to us about the Weddell Sea Marine Protected Area. Gary, please. Thank you. Because that was like, I want to know if you have to shout.
Okay, can everyone hear me now? Right. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk. My name's Gary Griffith. I'm a complex adaptive systems scientist, and I've been leading the science on behalf of the Norwegian Polar Institute through a project called the MAUD project for the latest MPA proposal that's been submitted to CCAMLR. So it's been interesting hearing the last two presentations, and I would classify myself as a conservation optimist. And I think it's very easy for all of us to get bogged down in the difficulties and the geopolitics of CCAMLR. And before I begin my talk, I would just like to perhaps change the focus a little bit and emphasize that in the development of this MPA has actually been an incredibly rewarding and enriching in terms of developing the knowledge for the area. But also, it is an attempt, and our proposal is an attempt to have CCAMLR change some of its views on MPAs. And what I mean that is, in the geopolitical world, there have always end up very defined policy decisions and so on, which make it very difficult as a scientist to develop an MPA in what we are seeing as an increasingly non-linear and dynamic environment. So I'd like to talk about the MPA for the Weddell Sea and focus on those dynamic aspects, and perhaps an awareness that in the years to come, we will need to develop MPAs that can be changed and altered quite rapidly in response to the changes that we're going to be seeing. So here's my presentation, and this proposal, this draft conservation measure, has been proposed by Norway, the United Kingdom, and Australia. So The MPA itself is very large. So to put it in perspective, it's approximately the same size of France and Germany. And I think following on from Matt's talk, which was, I guess, at a much higher level, this is perhaps an indication of what happens at the coalface of actually getting an MPA to a position where the geopolitics starts to play. So this MPA has a general protection zone, which is 720,000 square kilometres, and that consists of those areas A, B, C, D, and E. The reason why they're numbered differently is because each of those areas has particularly unique ecological and biological aspects that relate to the conservation objectives of the MPA. The next area, the seasonal protection zone, is our attempt to push the boundaries a little bit with CCAMLR in terms of their thinking about MPAs, and looking at having a seasonal protection zone. So this would be an area which for a particular part of the year all fishing is prohibited. And the reason why we're proposing this is that it's a key foraging area for the endangered Antarctic petrel, and also for a number of other top predator species. And the third one is a fisheries research zone. And following on a little bit from Matt about, obviously, CCAMLR has a very large fisheries focus. And this fisheries research zone is something historically where research and exploratory fishing has been undertaken. So in the Antarctic context, again, following on from, I guess, in a way, the two previous presentations, CCAMLR has been pursuing to have a circumpolar network of MPAs. And as Matt pointed out, there are two in existence at the moment, and another number of other proposals that have been at various stages of evolution. At the moment, they're pretty much all the proposed MPAs are at the same status, awaiting confirmation from CCAMLR. So why is this MPA needed? And I think this is also an important thing, that in the developing the science for this proposal, although we are the scientists, we also have to sell this. We have to socialize people to why this MPA is needed. And sometimes that's a very challenging thing to do, particularly in the CCAMLR context. 26 countries, large observer network as well, huge geopolitics playing on in the background. But at the end of the day, there has to be a fundamental reason for the MPA. And in our case, together with phase one, Weddell Sea MPA, we believe that this is a chance to protect a pristine region. And I think importantly in what's happening at COP29 is that this is a large area as a potential climate refugia for cold adapted species. It covers a wide range of habitats to support biological productivity, in particular marginal ice zone, and in line with many of the other MPA proposals, also protects foraging areas for endangered species. And a key aspect of this MPA, which is something again that we are trying, and through the Norwegian work, trying to push in CCAMLR, is the importance of, at least as a minimum, protecting those nursery areas, those larval areas, if you like, the foundations for any MPA and for any ecological functioning. And this MPA has aimed to protect large larval areas for key species such as krill. And the other part that I think is also part of this MPA story, which needs to evolve a lot more, is the need that the ocean world is obviously dynamic, and we need to offer some protection to those pathways that link all the areas to which we want to have some conservation applied. And in our case, we have some very important oceanographic pathways, both pelagic and benthic, that within the MPA area and also transport larvae. For example, larvae from the Weddell Sea area of this MPA are transported into Weddell Sea phase one and then through to the East Antarctic, into the Antarctic Peninsula. So there are 9 conservation objectives, and I'm sure all of you, like me, go through thousands of PowerPoint presentations. So it's there for anyone to have a look at, and I'm really not going to spend any time on it, except that there are 9 objectives. They've been very well considered, and they also link in with our colleagues who've been responsible for the Phase 1 MPA. So what's it based on? And I guess this is the conundrum for all of us working in this area. CCAMLR requires a huge amount of scientific evidence, and then of course you come up against the geopolitics. But in the developing of that science, as I said, we also develop new knowledge. We also develop new thinking, which can be applied in a global context as well as in the Weddell Sea. So part of this, and I think it's a key one, is extensive consultation with not only CCAMLR members, but also observers, communities such as ASOC, and the global scientific community. And in our case, we try to progress things a little more in the CCAMLR space by holding a series of international workshops to allow the community to develop the MPA. And I think that's been quite a successful approach. So, for further information, for those of you particularly on the nitty-gritty, we decided to have an atlas, a condominium for all the information which could be used not only for the scientific community, but also for policymakers. And I think having worked on MPAs before in other areas, and such as here in Aotearoa in New Zealand, where I currently am, it's very important to have that type of system that can also be played into the geopolitical environment as well. As part of the process, we also developed an interactive decision tool. And again, this is part of, I think, of the evolving space of being able to dynamically design and think about MPAs in view of the global challenges we are about to face. And there is some information on the CCAMLR MPA repository site as well. So, where are we with the proposal? So this is the newest proposal, was presented last year by Norway. United Kingdom joined as a co-proponent. And as in this environment, sometimes for realistic reasons, sometimes for other geopolitical reasons, we were asked to make some changes to the proposal, which we've now did. We presented it again. And Australia joined as a co-proponent, and we are, of course, hopeful that other CCAMLR members will also join as a co-proponent. Many members supported the proposal in this year's CCAMLR meeting, and as Matt pointed out, it was quite a challenging meeting. And currently, it, as with the other MPA proposals, requires a unanimous decision, and of course, that's not currently happening. So thank you for your attention, and yeah, I wish you all well in COP29. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for this detailed presentation of the Weddell MPA proposal. Can you hear me? Yes? Otherwise, would you like to come closer? Okay, fantastic. Would you like me to this way to move the slides? No? Okay. Now it's my turn. I'm Patricia Cavalcanti, and I'm here on behalf of ASOC. My colleagues who presented before me brought you detailed explanations about the science behind the MPAs and important concepts, as Pam pointed out, that we should not forget about when we think about the conservation of Antarctica. My presentation is a little bit different. I'm a Brazilian Argentinian, and I would like to bring to you the Latin American perspective of the conservation of Antarctica. We all sitting here know how crucial Antarctica conservation is for our survival. Yet, we're still today trying to figure out the best strategy to communicate the relevance of the issue and to build up bridges with different sectors of civil society, mainly with that sector or those sectors that are not convinced because they have no clear link with conservation. So how do we build up this? How do we reach them in another level? So one of the concepts I would like to discuss with you today is the concept of peace. Let me see if I can do this. Like that. Thank you. The other one. Sorry. Old lady trying to work with technology. Yes, thank you. Let's think about that. Antarctica stands as a testament of what humanity can actually achieve through unified purpose when we collaborate in peace. And yet today we're still here trying to figure out how to better craft the message. Let's think about the Antarctic Treaty for a moment. In 1959, we were able to sign this. We were in the peak of the Cold War. And even though the treaty marked a groundbreaking achievement in global diplomacy, the US and the former Soviet Union were able to find common ground and lay the foundation for a peaceful governance in Antarctica, declaring the area demilitarized and prioritizing scientific development. Only this should be absolutely amazing for all of us. Having said that, and understanding how crucial Antarctica conservation is, we are now facing a number of threats. And one possibility, not the only one, but one possibility of solving or trying to protect Antarctica is through the creation of marine protected areas. Mainly the crucial waters surrounding the Antarctica Peninsula. I come from South America, and if you look at the flag over here that we brought, and you look at the peninsula, you can only imagine how close we are to Antarctica. So for us, Antarctica goes beyond the idea of conservation. It's not because conservation is not fundamental. It's because it's part of our livelihood. It's part of our ecosystem. And I would dare to say it's also part of a certain sphere of our cultural identity. And that's what I would like to talk a little bit more about today. The Latin American countries are committed to Antarctica conservation. They are signatories of the Antarctic Treaty. They are members of CCAMLR, and they follow the principles of conservation there. Argentina and Chile, particularly, share a profound bond with Antarctica, not only based in geographic proximity, which is a reality, we just know a map, but also because of our rich history of exploration, our scientific endeavor, and our cultural connection. Argentina was a pioneer in Antarctica exploration. We all know that. The first scientific station was created in 1904. And after that, the Argentinian Antarctic program kept developing. And nowadays, Argentina counts with 13 scientific stations, by far the larger number among any other countries. Moreover, Argentina keeps a school in Antarctica to cater for the scientific teams and personal staff. This is very symbolic and shows the commitment that Argentina has with the conservation. Chile also boasts a rich history. Their first scientific station is from the 1940s, and after that, they tried their best to keep developing their programs in collaboration with a number of teams of scientists from different countries. Moreover, we have the city-gate cities, and one of them is Ushuaia in Argentina. And whoever have been to Antarctica from here, and I take for granted some of you have been there, you might have departure from Ushuaia, which holds the biggest percentage of not only scientific teams heading to Antarctica, but also tourist cruises. And this is something that's crucial and relevant because when we think about how to deal with this kind of topic, you have to take into consideration the link between Ushuaia and all the Antarctic issues. It's part of their cultural identity as well. Argentina and Chile are not the only countries with scientific stations there. Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, all of them keep bases there with scientific teams all over the year and developing educational programs and being part of the governance of Antarctica. So add to this the intricate ecosystem relation that has the southern part of Latin America and Antarctica. We know that the species migrate from one area to another. So when we think from the perspective of Latin America, you understand that the conservation of Antarctica, it's not only crucial because of the conservation per se, but it's also part of the livelihood and their ecosystems. Argentina and Chile understood this from the very beginning, and they took the responsibility. So from 2012 on, they started working together to develop a proposal for the Dominion 1 Marine Protected Area that's in the Peninsula Antarctica. It's also called the D1 MPA or the DIMPA. From now on, I'll call the D1. Okay? The D1 proposal is based in the best science available, and it's crucial because it includes an area that you have the krill development there, and also a number of fish species there. Argentina and Chile were able to develop this proposal, and they presented during the 37th Scientific Committee meeting of CCAMLR in 2018. However, here we are, and after all these years, after all the efforts Argentina and Chile put on this, unfortunately, the MPA hasn't been approved yet. We know that CCAMLR works by consensus, and this consensus has been evasive till now. This doesn't mean that we should just forget about the whole issue. What we have to do is to renew our energy and disposition to be able to find new diplomatic channels to dialogue with every single member of CCAMLR and present to them the urgency of establishing MPAs in the Southern Ocean, and mainly one like the Dominion 1 that would cover 18.7% of the area and would help managing fishery. There is a point that for me is fundamental, and for the general public to understand that protecting Antarctica and economic development are not mutually exclusive systems or points. They are part of the same idea. We have to find balance between, destructive activities and the conservation of Antarctica. Science proves that MPAs actually help boost fish stock, help control the ecosystems, and support a better management of economic activities. So to sum up this, I think what we need to find out now is a way to recover the idea of unity that actually allowed the Antarctic Treaty to be signed so many years ago, and figure out other possible communication channels to make this big audience to understand the responsibility we have today. Our decisions today will be the history for tomorrow, and whatever we do about MPAs, we're going to leave this for future generations. So that's why it's so important to find out possible paths of dialogue, and Latin America is absolutely committed to that. Thank you so much for your attention. It was a pleasure to be here. Do we have any questions, Emmy, to any of the speakers? Do you have any questions for?
What kind of restrictions would be advantageous in the marine protected areas? So, fishing.
May I go close?
Okay.
It's very noisy. Sorry. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's incredibly noisy.
What are the restrictions that would be necessary? What activities would be restricted?
It's not a question of restriction per se. It's a question of balance. What we can limit, what we can establish as measurements that will allow this balance between the kind of economic activities that we know or carry on, but in a sustainable way that allows the conservation of the area. Somebody told me before the presentation something very interesting, how difficult it is to explain to fishery companies that if they fish everything, there will be no more fish. So it's a question of dialogue and how we craft the narrative and how we explain to them the science behind and how we can establish these restrictions. That's not exactly a restriction per se, but a limitation to be able to construct a better ecosystem that's going to permit all of us to keep alive. Gary and Matt, would you like to answer this as well? I still have Matt over there.
I can quickly jump in. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Patricia, but alongside restrictions, you also need effective monitoring. So as the report flags, the Southern Ocean is undergoing very, very rapid changes. And we're fishing on species that we might have stock assessments for, but how that interplays on an ecosystem-based management it needs factoring in as well. Gary, I'll pass over to you as well if you had any further thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and I think I've probably got 2 points to make. I think as far as the fishing industry goes, and I've had a lot of dialogue with them, it's very important with the MPAs to show that MPAs contribute to their sustainable management by, for example, providing the larval areas. And so there's a socializing of the fishing industry that's required from MPA proponents. And at the moment, unfortunately, I think the divide between the two worlds has actually got a lot larger. So, and I think that's something that everyone needs to consider. I mean, you can't really go to a fisherman and criticize them for fishing when it's their livelihood or their business. You have to be able to socialize them to what benefit the conservation is going to provide to their system. And unfortunately in CCAMLR, that's a debate that really there needs to be a lot more debate on. So I would encourage everyone to take the effort to socialize more with the fishing industry and not have this huge divide between MPAs and fishing.
Thank you so much for your question. Do you have another question or anybody else would like to ask questions to the panel?
Question. I think one of the kind of big criticisms of CCAMLR has been that climate change is not incorporated into the conversation or into the marine protected areas, sometimes to some degree. And I was wondering if there was evidence that was changing, and also if you can put forward any ideas that you have that could change this as well.
Gary, Matt, who would like to answer first?
Okay. Yeah, there is actually. There's a really great group within CCAMLR now that are. There was a workshop held, which was convened by Enrico Pardo from the Department of Conservation New Zealand and from Rachel from the surname, in the United Kingdom on climate change. And those papers have been presented to CCAMLR and have had a great reception. So I think everyone's aware of that. And there is now a group set up to investigate how climate change can be considered in the CCAMLR context. So that's a positive step. The geopolitics, of course, challenging. So what my suggestion, I mean, we looked at climate change in a fairly rough and ready way for phase 2. I think that the issue is, again, socializing of what climate change actually means in the Southern Ocean and Antarctic context. And I do have some ideas, but I might pass over to Matt on that. And let him make comment.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. To flag as well, CCAMLR created a resolution specifically around climate change to take it into account with all of its working. So it is present within the focus of the organisation. Gary's already touched upon climate refugia being noted as part of the Weddell Sea Phase 2 MPA. So it is focused. I hark back to the answer I gave to the last question as well, is like we need to get better monitoring. We need to have a better pan-Southern Ocean monitoring network to establish this. And Rod, I'm sure there's a very exciting presentation later on today looking at how potentially krill how we know they're moving, where are they moving? We just don't know for a lot of these sentinel species. We understand a lot of the abiotic factors that they're changing, so acidity, changing weather patterns, and we're getting snapshots of species in certain areas moving, but how that makes a bigger picture, particularly with krill and the numerous species that depend on it, is key to continue to build upon.
Thank you. Any other question?
And maybe I missed it, but what other pressures does the area face besides the fishing issue and climate change? Are there any other problems that Antarctica faces?
Pam, did you hear? I'm very sorry. It's not your fault. I'm here. You're there.
No. Yeah, I did.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Matt. Matt hear you better in England than I am. I'm 15 centimeters from you. Sorry, Matt, please.
No, I think Gary was going to jump in first. I'll come in after.
Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, so I took the question that the threats were climate change and fisheries.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So if
there is.
Yeah, there's numerous others. Sorry, Gary, you go.
Is there anything else? Is there any other kinds of pressures that the area faces? Because, for example, in my country, marine protected areas, fishing is an issue, but also biodiversity loss and those kinds of things. So marine protected areas are established in order to create limitations on what land use activities can be done in that area. But in the context of Antarctica, it might be a bit more difficult to regulate. So I just want to know what other threats or pressures does the area face besides overexploitation of fishing or climate change, sea level rise?
Yeah, very interesting question. And the answer is trophic changes are actually a threat. So while we have climate change, what I meant by trophic changes, for example, is if we have an increasing population of one particular species, that actually has a negative effect. And one example would be the increasing of some particular top predators as a consequence of the environmental change. So yeah, so fisheries, definitely, climate change, but also changes in the trophic structure, which lead to some species being adversely affected.
Thank you very much for it. Do you have another question for them? Anybody else? Another question?
Patricia, can I just also quickly jump in response
yes,
to that question as well?
Please. Go ahead, Matt.
Particularly in the peninsula as well, we're seeing a sharply increasing tourism sector. And so alongside this, you have secondary effects of disturbance at landing sites. You're seeing increased rates of pollution, both direct and indirect. And that is, I know IATO, who are the governing body for tourism down there, are looking to address, but it is a pretty substantial threat in particularly the peninsula, an area that's undergoing quite a lot of change and has already quite a lot of cumulative pressures already in existence.
Thank you so much, Matt. Another question? No? Thank you so much, you all, to be here with us today. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Gary, for the brilliant presentations. Pam, thank you so much for your presentation as well, and be a member of our panel. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you to all of you. Have a great day.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of COP.
Yeah.
Speaking for.